Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are doing something a little different. Usually, when we look at history, we pick an event, a war, a movement, a scandal.
A big, broad topic.
Exactly. But today, we're focusing on a person. And not just any person. We're looking at a man who, you could argue, acts as the connective tissue for the entire American counterculture of the 20th century.
It is a massive claim, but I think the sources back it up completely. I mean, if you really look at the literary and cultural timeline of America from, say, 1945 all the way to 1997, there is one figure who is just. He's present at almost every single major cultural inflection point.
We're talking about Allen Ginsberg. And I think for a lot of people, the name Allen Ginsberg conjures up a very specific, almost a cartoonish image.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, the bald head with the ring of hair, the big
Yeah.
bushy beard, the thick glasses. Maybe he's playing a harmonium and chanting Om in a park somewhere while people in tie-dye dance around him.
Exactly. The hippie poet caricature.
Yeah.
And look, don't get me wrong, he was that. That part is true.
He leaned into it.
He absolutely leaned into it. But that is just the surface layer. And if you stop there, you miss the actual engine of the man. Because this is the guy who bridged the gap between the intellectual literary beats of the 1950s, Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs, and the full-blown hippie explosion of the 1960s.
But then, and this is the part that gets me, he didn't stop there. He kept going right into the punk era of the 70s and 80s.
That's the part that blows my mind.
He was hanging out with The Clash.
He was on stage with The Clash. He's on one of their records. So our mission today, looking at this stack of biographies and letters and even FBI files, is to move past that caricature. We want to explore the complex, often contradictory figure who fought for free speech, who explored Eastern spirituality way before it was cool.
Before the Beatles went to India.
Way before. He investigated the CIA, and he wrote arguably the most influential American poem of the century, Howl.
And we are going to get into the messy stuff, too. The madness, the drugs, the controversies. Because, I mean, you can't really understand the art without understanding the trauma that fueled it.
You really can't. They're completely intertwined.
So let's unpack this. Where does the story of Allen Ginsberg actually begin?
Well, to understand the man, you have to understand the child. And to understand the child, you have to go to New Jersey in the 1920s and 30s. Ginsberg was born in 1926, grew up in Newark and later Paterson. And, on the surface, it looked like a pretty standard Jewish-American upbringing for the time.
But the household dynamic was, well, anything but standard.
It was a house divided. It's actually a perfect study in contrast. On one side, you have his father, Louis Ginsberg.
Right.
And Louis was a school teacher. He was a responsible citizen. He paid his taxes. He was a pillar of the community. And he was also a published poet, but of a very, very specific kind.
The sources describe him as a traditionalist, which feels like an understatement.
A huge understatement. Louis wrote in strict rhyme and meter, A-B rhyme schemes. He loved the classics, Longfellow, Emily Dickinson. He was what Allen later affectionately called an old-fashioned delicatessen philosopher.
I love that phrase.
It's perfect, isn't it? It just captures this idea of a man who believed in order. He believed that poetry should be polite, it should be structured, and above all, it should be understandable. It shouldn't be confusing or offensive.
So you have this pillar of stability and tradition on one side of the house, and then on the other side,
You have Naomi, Allen's mother. And Naomi Ginsberg is, without a doubt, the single most important and most powerful figure in Allen's life.
a force of nature, it sounds like.
Absolutely. She was a Russian immigrant, a fervent Marxist, and a card-carrying member of the Communist Party during a time when that was, a very radical thing to be.
So she's already politically on the fringes.
Oh, yeah. Radical doesn't even begin to cover it. But alongside her politics, she suffered from severe, debilitating mental illness. The diagnoses in the sources vary a bit, but it aligns pretty clearly with paranoid schizophrenia.
And we're not talking about just, mom is eccentric or has some quirks. This was dangerous, terrifying stuff.
It was a nightmare for a child to witness. Her delusions were incredibly vivid and all-consuming. She believed that the President of the United States, that Franklin Roosevelt, had personally implanted listening devices in their home in Paterson to spy on her communist meetings.
Wow.
She thought her mother-in-law, Louise's mother, was constantly plotting to kill her. She would see conspiracies everywhere, wires in the walls, poison in the food.
There's a detail in one of the biographies that really stuck with me about her bedtime stories. Most kids get Cinderella or Goldilocks.
Not Allen. Allen got Marxist parables. Naomi would tell him these stories about the good king. But in her version, the good king would ride out from his castle, and he would see the suffering workers, the sick peasants, and he would use his power to heal them. It was this strange, intense mix of political ideology and maternal care, all wrapped up in a fairy tale.
So she's teaching him her politics from the very beginning.
Absolutely. But her illness meant she was also deeply, deeply paranoid about the outside world.
Which would naturally lead her to draw Allen very close.
Incredibly close. She didn't trust anyone else. She called Allen her little pet. It created this intense, almost suffocating bond between them. He wasn't just her friend. He became her caretaker, her confidant, her anchor to reality, as flimsy as it was.
And he saw things no child should ever have to see.
He witnessed her suicide attempts. The sources are pretty explicit about her slitting her wrists. He saw her in states of complete undress, screaming in paranoia at phantoms in the room. And he was the one, often, who had to accompany her on the bus to the mental institution, Greystone Park.
That image is it's haunting. A young boy taking his mother to the asylum.
It is. And that trauma right there is the fuel. If you look at his major works, Howl, and especially his other epic poem, Kaddish, they are directly metabolized from this experience. He's taking this raw, terrifying private pain and turning it into public art.
And you can see why he couldn't follow in his father's footsteps, poetically.
How could he?
Yeah.
He didn't hide from the madness. He didn't try to bury it like his father might have wanted to. He realized early on that the polite, rhyming, orderly world of his father couldn't possibly explain the chaotic, terrifying, unpredictable world of his mother.
So he needed a new language?
Exactly. He needed a language that was big enough and strong enough and maybe crazy enough to hold all that madness.
So let's move forward a bit. He survives this childhood somehow. He's obviously a very smart kid. He graduates high school and he heads to Columbia University. And this feels like the moment the movie really starts.
This is the crucible. This is where all the elements come together. He enters Columbia in the mid-1940s. And interestingly enough, his initial plan was to study law.
He wanted to be a lawyer. That is just, it's hilarious considering how much time he spent fighting the law later in his life.
It is. But it came from a very sincere place. He wanted to be a labor lawyer. He wanted to defend the working class, help the little guy. He was trying to honor his mother's Marxist ideals in a practical American way.
But that plan gets derailed pretty quickly.
Very quickly. It gets derailed the moment he meets the people who will completely change his life, and by extension, American literature.
The heavy hitters. The core of the Beat generation.
The whole crew.
Mm-hmm.
Lucien Carr, who was this sort of charismatic, rebellious, Rimbaud-esque figure. William S. Burroughs, the older, mysterious, sardonic heir to a fortune. And, of course, the golden boy, the football star, Jack Kerouac.
It's just wild to think of them just hanging out in dorm rooms at Columbia, smoking cigarettes and planning a literary revolution. Kerouac had a nickname for Ginsberg, right?
I did. He called him Carlo Marx.
Oh, Marx. Perfect.
It was partly a reference to his Jewish background and his mother's communism, but it was also because Ginsberg was the intellectual of the group. He was the one with the big philosophical ideas.
So what were they bonding over? What was the mission?
They bonded over a shared sense of rejection. You have to remember the context of the time. This is post-World War II America. The McCarthy era is just starting to ramp up. The culture is obsessed with conformity.
The man in the gray flannel suit.
Exactly. The message to young men was crystal clear. Get a degree, get a corporate job, buy a house in the suburbs with a white picket fence, keep your mouth shut, and be normal.
And this group, they were not interested in normal.
Not at all. They wanted what they called a new vision. That's the actual phrase they used. They were rejecting the polite academic poetry that was popular at the time, which was very dry, very T.S. Eliot influenced. They wanted something raw. They were reading Yeats, Rimbaud, the French symbolists. They wanted art that bled.
But it wasn't just an intellectual exercise for them. They were living it. They were living chaotically. And Ginsberg actually got into some serious trouble at Columbia, didn't he?
He was suspended and then prosecuted. And the story behind it is just, it's absurd. It's like a bad crime novel that they would have loved.
What happened?
Ginsberg was letting an acquaintance, a guy from the sort of Times Square underworld they were all fascinated with, store some goods in his dorm room.
Goods. I like the euphemism.
Right. Stolen goods. The acquaintance was a thief. So when the campus authorities eventually raided the room and found all this stolen property, Ginsberg was on the hook. He was facing serious criminal prosecution. He was probably going to go to jail.
So what does he do? He's trapped.
He plays the card he has been holding his whole life.
Yeah.
He pleads insanity.
He used the madness as a strategy.
It was a brilliant, desperate move. He and his professors basically convinced the authorities that he wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just this mentally unwell, confused kid who fell in with the wrong crowd. And because of his family history with Naomi, it was a totally plausible defense.
So instead of prison.
Instead of prison, he spent several months in the Columbia Presbyterian Psychiatric Institute.
Which ironically brings him right back into the world of his mother, the world of institutions.
It does. And it's absolutely pivotal because it's in that institution that he meets a man named Carl Solomon. The one and only. And if you have ever read Howl, you know that name. The entire third section of the poem is a chant, "I'm with you in Rockland," which was the asylum Solomon was later transferred to. For Ginsberg, Carl Solomon became the ultimate symbol of the brilliant, sensitive genius crushed by the machinery of society.
So he comes out of the institution, he's back in New York, he's been through the ringer, and then in 1948, something happens that changes the entire trajectory of his life forever. He stops being just a rebellious student and becomes, well, something of a mystic.
The Blake Vision. This is the moment. This is his origin story as a prophet. Ginsberg is living in an apartment in East Harlem. He's alone. He's feeling alienated, probably a bit depressed. And the sources are very, very specific about what he was doing at the time.
We should probably just say it.
We should. He was pleasuring himself.
Right. He was masturbating while reading the poetry of William Blake.
Specifically, the songs of innocence and of experience. He was looking at the poems, Sunflower and the Sick Rose.
It's a very Ginsberg combination, isn't it? The profane and the sacred just smashed together.
That's his whole ethos in a nutshell. And in that state of, physical release and intense intellectual focus, he experiences a profound auditory hallucination. He hears a voice, a deep, ancient, gravelly voice reciting the poems aloud to him.
Did he think it was God?
He thought it was the voice of God, or maybe the voice of Blake himself reaching across the centuries from the grave. But it wasn't just the voice. He looked out his apartment window at the fire escape, and he had this sudden, overwhelming visual realization. He saw the fire escape, and he saw the sky above it, and he understood in a flash that the fire escape was made by human hands, but the sky was self-created. It was a manifestation of cosmic intelligence.
That sounds like a simple observation, but for him it was everything.
It was the interconnectedness of the universe. That was his phrase. He felt he was seeing the face of God in the architecture of the city. He realized that everything was holy. The sky, the fire escape, his own body, the book in his hands, it all clicked.
Now, the obvious question, given Ginsberg's later reputation, was he high when this happened?
That is the absolute key point. He insisted for the rest of his life that he was not. He was stone cold sober. But, and this is a huge but, he spent the next huge chunk of his life trying to get back to that feeling using drugs. He used LSD, peyote, marijuana, ayahuasca, you name it. He was always trying to recreate or trigger that cosmic consciousness again. But the original vision, that was completely natural.
So he has the trauma from his mother, he has the intellectual training from Columbia, and now he has the spiritual mandate. He feels like he's a prophet with a message.
And prophets need a wilderness to go to, or in his case, a new city. So he goes west.
To San Francisco. And this is the early 1950s, the San Francisco Renaissance. This is where the Beat generation really stops being a private club and goes public.
He arrives in San Francisco and, believe it or not, gets a steady 9-to-5 job. He works in market research.
I cannot picture Allen Ginsberg in an office, in a suit, analyzing why people buy a certain brand of toothpaste.
He was apparently quite good at it. He had a knack for understanding how people thought and what motivated them. But that was just the day job. By night, he is writing furiously. He meets Peter Orlovsky in 1954, who becomes his lifelong partner. And he starts to organize the local poetry scene, which was vibrant but kind of fragmented.
Which leads to the legendary night, the one that gets written about in all books, October 7, 1955, the Sixth Gallery reading.
If you could build a time machine and go back to one single literary event in American history, this is the one you choose. The Sixth Gallery was basically a converted auto repair shop. It wasn't some fancy auditorium. Ginsberg organized a reading with a bunch of his new poet friends, Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, Michael McClure.
And Kerouac was there too.
Kerouac was there, but he wasn't on the bill to read. He was the hype man, the master of ceremonies. The sources have this great image of him going around with a hat, collecting spare change from the audience to buy these big gallon jugs of cheap red wine.
So the atmosphere is loose.
Very loose. The room is packed, it's smoky, everyone is getting drunk on this cheap wine and just buzzing with anticipation for something new.
And then Ginsberg steps up to the makeshift stage.
He steps up, he's nervous at first, then he takes a few big gulps of wine, he's drunk, he's passionate, and he just unleashes Howl.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked.
Just hearing that line, it's an assault, it's aggressive, it's breathless. This is not the polite, metered poetry of his father. Kerouac described him reading with his arms outstretched, swaying, almost screaming the lines. It was a rhythmic, physical, incantatory performance. It was like a sermon.
Let's break down Howl for a second, because it's not just a chaotic rant, which is how some people see it. It has a very clear structure, and it has a villain.
It does. It absolutely does.
Sure.
The poem is divided into three main parts. The first part is this long Whitman-esque catalog of the best minds, his friends, the junkies, the travelers, the artists, the outcasts, and all the ways that society has destroyed them.
And then you get to part two.
And part two introduces the monster responsible for all that destruction. Moloch.
Moloch. Where does that name come from?
In the Bible, in the Old Testament, Moloch is an ancient Canaanite god that was associated with child sacrifice. People would literally burn their children as offerings to appease this god. But in Howl, Moloch isn't some ancient stone statue. Moloch is modern American society.
Moloch whose mind is pure machinery. Moloch whose blood is running money. Moloch whose fingers are 10 armies.
Yes. Moloch is capitalism. Moloch is the military-industrial complex. Moloch is the crushing pressure to conform, to be a cog in the machine. It's the soulless, robotic force that eats individuality for breakfast.
And there's a great backstory in the sources on where she got the actual visual for Moloch. It wasn't just an abstract idea.
No, it came from a vision. He was in San Francisco, high on peyote this time, and he was looking at the Sir Francis Drake Hotel, a big, imposing building. And under the influence of the drug, he saw the facade of the building transform. He saw the windows turn into the empty eyes of a skull. He saw the whole building as a giant, devouring monster eating the city. That hallucination became the face of Moloch.
It's incredible how he takes these deeply personal, often drug-induced visions and turns them into these powerful metaphors for social commentary.
That's his genius.
But the authorities in 1956 did not see social commentary. They saw filth.
They saw obscenity, plain and simple. The poem was published as a book by City Lights Books, which was run by the poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti. The police seized the books, they arrested Ferlinghetti and the bookstore clerk. They charged the book with being obscene, specifically because of the graphic depictions of sexuality.
We have to remember the context. This is the mid-1950s.
Exactly. Sodomy laws are in full effect in every state. Being gay is not just frowned upon, it's effectively illegal. It's classified as a mental illness. And here is Allen Ginsberg writing these incredibly explicit lines about cocksuckers and men getting fucked in the ass by saintly motorcyclists and celebrating it. He wasn't using euphemisms, he was shouting it from the rooftops.
The trial must have been an absolute circus.
It was a pivotal moment for the First Amendment in America. And the judge presiding over the case was a man named Clayton W. Horn. And get this, he was a Sunday school teacher.
Oh, no.
Right. Everyone in the literary world assumed he would look at this filth and throw the book at them, literally. They thought City Lights was going to be shut down.
But he didn't do that.
He did the opposite. He actually listened. He listened to the literary experts and critics who came to testify that the poem had artistic merit, that it was a serious work of literature, not just pornography, and he delivered this landmark ruling that is still the gold standard for obscenity cases today. He ruled that if a work has even the slightest redeeming social importance, it cannot be legally considered obscene.
I have the quote from the judge here. He said, "Would there be any freedom of press or speech if one must reduce his vocabulary to vapid, innocuous euphemisms?"
I mean, what a line. It was a complete and sort of slam dunk for free speech. And the great irony, of course, is that the trial made Ginsberg an international celebrity. Before the trial, he was a locally known San Francisco poet. After the trial, he was on the front page of newspapers. The government's attempt to censor him backfired spectacularly.
So now he's famous. He's the king of the beats. But Ginsberg has this deep-seated restlessness. He doesn't just stay in San Francisco and enjoy the poem. He goes to Paris. He lives in the famous Beat Hotel with Burroughs and Gregory Corso. But then the real spiritual shift happens in the early 1960s. He goes to India.
This is the next major chapter. This is where we see the transition from the angry young poet screaming about Moloch to the spiritual guru who starts chanting Om.
What drove him to India? Was he just tired of the West?
It was a kind of desperation in a way. He was famous, but he was deeply unhappy. He was still chasing that Blake vision. He felt spiritually hollow. He felt like the anger of Howl had sort of burned him out. So he and Peter Orlovsky decided to travel to India in 1962, and they ended up staying for nearly 2 years.
And they weren't doing the luxury tourist thing, staying in nice hotels?
Not at all. They were living on pennies a day. They stayed in the slums of Calcutta and Varanasi. They spent most of their time at the burning ghats on the Ganges, just watching bodies being cremated day in and day out, contemplating mortality. They hung out with the sadhus, the wandering holy men who covered themselves in ash and renounced the material world.
Mhm.
Ginsberg was looking for a teacher. He was looking for a method.
And this is where he really connects deeply with Buddhism and Hinduism.
He had been interested in it since the 50s. Kerouac was a huge influence there with his book, The Dharma Bums. But in India, Ginsberg didn't just read about it, he practiced it. He learned meditation. He learned to chant mantras. He bought a harmonium, that boxy accordion-like instrument you always see him with in pictures from that era.
What did the chanting actually do for him? Was it just a performance, a new kind of poetry?
No, for him it was physiological. It was a technology. He realized that the long, sustained breath required for chanting literally calmed his nervous system. It stabilized his mind. It was a way, he said, to get high without having to rely on drugs, which were becoming unpredictable for him.
And when he came back to America in the mid-60s, he brought that practice with him.
He became the hippie bridge. This is a crucial role he played. In the mid-60s, you have the explosion of the hippie counterculture. You have all these kids dropping out, taking acid, looking for spiritual meaning, but without any roadmap. Ginsberg looked at them and saw they were brilliant, but also unstable. And he thought, I can help them. I can give them a tool. I can give them a practice.
So he starts chanting everywhere.
Everywhere. He becomes the single biggest promoter of the Hare Krishna movement in the West. He befriended Swami Prabhupada, the founder of the Hare Krishnas in New York's Lower East Side. He used his fame to help them get a temple, to get a record deal. He made them legitimate in the eyes of the counterculture.
There's the famous story of the Mantra Rock Dance in 1967.
Oh, the Avalon Ballroom in San Francisco, a legendary lineup. You have the Grateful Dead, you have Janis Joplin with Big Brother and the Holding Company, you have Moby Grape, and then right in the middle of this psychedelic rock show, you have Allen Ginsberg and the Hare Krishnas in their robes leading thousands of hippies in chanting Hare Krishna.
It's an incredible image.
He made it cool to be spiritual in that way. He validated Eastern religion for a whole generation of rock and roll kids who would have never picked up a Bhagavad Gita otherwise.
But he didn't just stay in the ashram. He took that spirituality
Right.
and he weaponized it politically.
Weaponized is an interesting word, but I think it's accurate. He used chanting as a form of nonviolent protest, as a political tool.
The 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Chicago, 1968. The whole world is watching. You have the Vietnam War protests raging. The police are rioting. They're beating protesters in the streets with billy clubs. There's tear gas everywhere. It is a war zone. And what does Allen Ginsberg do?
He doesn't throw rocks back at the cops.
He walks right into the middle of Lincoln Park, sits down on the grass, pulls out his harmonium, and just starts chanting, "Oom," for hours.
What did he think that was going to accomplish? Did he think it would stop the tear gas?
He believed in the physics of sound. He genuinely believed that if he could create a steady, peaceful vibration, the sound of Om, it would literally lower the temperature of the violence. It would give the panicked protesters a center of gravity so they wouldn't freak out and get violent themselves. It was an act of sonic peacemaking.
It's such a unique approach to activism, not fighting fire with fire, but fighting fire with breath.
But don't let the gentle chanting fool you. When it came to hard-nosed politics, Ginsberg was sharp as a tack. He was an investigator.
And this brings us to his obsession with the CIA.
This is one of my favorite parts of the whole Ginsberg saga because it shows how he was so often ahead of the curve. In the 1970s, he became completely convinced that the CIA was deeply involved in heroin trafficking in the Golden Triangle. That's Southeast Asia, Laos, Burma, Thailand.
Which, at the time, must have sounded like a completely bonkers conspiracy theory.
It sounds totally nuts. The government is secretly selling drugs to fund its secret wars.
Yeah.
People just dismissed him. They said, oh, that's just Allen. You know, he's high, he's paranoid. But Ginsberg did the homework. He spent 10 years collecting newspaper clippings. He talked to sources. He compiled this massive file. He claimed the CIA was using the drug trade to pay its proxy armies in Laos and Vietnam.
He even confronted the head of the CIA about it.
Yes, this is amazing. He met Richard Helms, the former CIA director, at some public event. And Ginsberg, being Ginsberg, just walked right up to him and confronted him. He bet him $10 that he was right about the heroin trafficking. Helms, of course, denied it and called him ridiculous.
But Ginsberg was right.
He was 100% right. In 1972, a historian named Alfred McCoy published a massive, meticulously researched book called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, and it laid out all the proof. The CIA was absolutely complicit.
And the New York Times actually had to apologize to him.
The editor at the time, C.L. Sulzberger, wrote Ginsberg a personal note that essentially said, "You were right, and we were wrong to dismiss you as a crank." It was total vindication for him.
So he's fighting the American government. But he wasn't exactly a darling of the authoritarian leftists either.
This is what makes him so interesting and so hard to pin down politically. He wasn't a partisan hack. He was an equal opportunity agitator. He was a socialist, yes. But he had zero patience for authoritarianism, even if it came from his own side.
The Cuba story is a classic example of this.
In 1965, he gets invited to Havana to be a judge for a literary prize. He's excited to see the great Cuban Revolution up close. But he gets there, and he immediately sees that Fidel Castro's regime is persecuting gay people, sending them to labor camps. And Ginsberg just cannot keep his mouth shut.
What did he do?
He started publicly protesting the treatment of homosexuals. He complained about the lack of marijuana, and according to some reports, he allegedly called Che Guevara cute and said he wanted to sleep with him.
I can't imagine the Cuban authorities appreciated that very much.
They did not. A few days later, they knocked on his hotel room door, told him he was a bad influence, and deported him. They put him on the next plane out, which happened to be going to Prague, Czechoslovakia.
So out of the revolutionary frying pan and into the Soviet fire?
Exactly. He lands in Prague, which is under a very repressive Soviet control. And the students there, who are living under this gray, conformist regime, they see Ginsberg as this icon of freedom. They embrace him. At their annual Mahales Festival, they elect him the King of May. It's this huge, joyous, spontaneous celebration of freedom and poetry.
And you can be sure the secret police are watching all of this.
As ATB, they are tracking his every move. They raid his apartment, they steal his personal journals, they read them and declare them lewd and degenerate. And within a week of being crowned King of May, he is expelled from Czechoslovakia too.
So he was too gay for the communists and too communist for the Americans?
He was a man without a country, in a way. He lived in his own sovereign state of radical openness.
And speaking of that radical openness, we have to address the most controversial and, for many people, the most disturbing aspect of his life. We can't do a deep dive and just skip the things that make people profoundly uncomfortable.
No, you can't. And you're referring to his involvement with NAMBL.
Yes. The North American Man-Boy Love Association, the sources are very clear on this. Allen Ginsberg was a member.
He was. And this is where we have to be very precise about just reporting the facts from the sources. Ginsberg joined the group, and he publicly defended it.
How on earth did he justify that? What was his rationale?
He framed it primarily as a free speech issue and as an issue of non-judgment. He viewed it as just another frontier of sexual liberation. He is on the record as saying, this is a direct quote from him, "I'm a member of MBLA because I love boys too, everybody does, who has a little humanity."
That statement. It's incredibly disturbing to hear today.
It is. It's shocking. And it wasn't just a passive membership for him. He wrote poems about it. He called them pederast rhapsodies, where he graphically described his attractions and fantasies.
And this put him at war with other parts of the counterculture that had once been his allies, specifically the feminist movement.
Yes. The radical feminist, Andrea Dworkin in particular, went after him hard. She argued that this wasn't about liberation or free speech. She saw it as predatory and abusive. She accused Ginsberg of using his intellectual status and his fame to justify the abuse of children.
And what was Ginsberg's response to that?
He didn't back down an inch. He accused Dworkin of projecting her own trauma onto him. He refused to feel shame about any of his desires. It was a massive, ugly, and very public conflict. But it's important to include this because it shows the absolute extreme edge of his philosophy. He believed in candor at all costs. He believed in revealing every single thought, no matter how taboo or repulsive it was to the rest of society.
He didn't want to hide any part of himself.
Nothing. He wanted the world to see the madness and the darkness right alongside the spiritual light. It was all part of the same human package for him.
Let's pivot back to his poetry for a minute, because while he's causing all these international incidents and controversies, he is also constantly refining his craft. He had some really specific techniques he used.
He was a serious technician. He wasn't just splattering feelings on a page. He talked a lot about the eyeball kick.
The eyeball kick. Explain that.
He got this idea from looking at the paintings of the post-impressionist artist Paul Cézanne. He noticed that Cézanne would put two contrasting patches of color right next to each other on the canvas, like a bright red right next to a bright green. And when your eye hits that border between the two colors, it spasms, it vibrates, it creates a little jolt in your perception.
And he wanted to do that with words.
Exactly. He wanted to jam two completely opposite images or ideas together in a single phrase to make the reader's mind jump. The most famous example, of course, is the phrase hydrogen jukebox from Howl.
Hydrogen and jukebox. Two words that have no business being together.
None at all. Hydrogen brings up the H-bomb, science destruction, Cold War terror. Jukebox brings up teenagers, diners, rock and roll, fun, pop culture. You smash them together, hydrogen jukebox, and you create a brand new third image in the reader's mind that is both terrifying and electric. That jolt, that's the kick.
And he also believed in what he called spontaneous prose.
First thought, best thought. This was originally a Kerouac idea, but Ginsberg adopted it and made it his own. The idea is that the mind is inherently holy. So if a thought or an image comes into your head as you're writing, it's true and pure. If you stop to edit it or censor it, you are lying. You're getting in the way of the divine flow.
But did he actually practice that? Did he never revise his poems?
The truth is, he did revise his poems. The manuscripts for Howl show a lot of revision. But the goal, the aesthetic he was aiming for, was to capture the raw, unfiltered flow of consciousness.
We talked a lot about Howl, but many literary critics actually say his greatest single work is Kaddish.
I would agree with that. I think Kaddish is his masterpiece, and it brings us full circle right back to the beginning of our story, back to his mother, Naomi.
Naomi died in 1956 while she was still institutionalized.
She died in the mental hospital. And because of the circumstances, there was no minyan, the required quorum of 10 Jewish men, to say the traditional Kaddish, the prayer for the dead, at her funeral.
Ginsberg was devastated by that failure.
He was. He carried that guilt with him. He felt he had failed her in her death as he had so often failed to save her in her life. So a few years later, he wrote his own Kaddish. And it is a long, brutal, absolutely heartbreaking poem. It is essentially a biography of her madness.
He doesn't sugarcoat any of it.
Not at all. It is unflinching. He describes the scars on her belly from the lobotomy. He describes her vomit. He describes her paranoia. He describes her nudity. It is incredibly raw and graphic. But through all that grotesquerie, there's this immense, overwhelming love. He's trying to give her back her dignity by bearing witness to her suffering in a way no one else would.
There is a specific detail in the poem, a letter she wrote to him from the hospital.
This is the emotional core of the entire poem. 2 days before she died, in a rare moment of lucidity, she wrote him a letter from the hospital. It said, "The key is in the window. The key is in the sunlight in the window. I have the key. Get married, Allen. Don't take drugs."
The key is in the sunlight.
That image, the key in the sunlight, haunts the poem. It represents this fleeting moment of peace and clarity she was always looking for, but could never quite grasp because of her illness. And in a way, you could say Ginsberg spent his whole life looking for that key, too.
As we move into the later years of his life, the 70s, 80s, 90s, Ginsberg achieves this really weird status. He becomes the grandfather of the counterculture.
He refused to become irrelevant. A lot of the 60s icons either burned out, faded away, or became these sad self-parodies. Ginsberg just kept adapting. When punk rock happened in the late 70s, he didn't look at it and say, oh, that's just noise, it's not like the 60s. He said, this is the energy, this is the new beat.
He hung out with The Clash.
He collaborated with them. He's on the track Ghetto Defendant on their classic album Combat Rock. You can hear him in the background, reciting his poetry. He toured with Bob Dylan on the legendary Rolling Thunder Revue. He recorded a track with Paul McCartney.
He just stayed curious.
That is the defining trait of his later years. He never stopped being curious. He was always looking for the next new vision. He was teaching at Brooklyn College. He became a distinguished professor, but he was still showing up at punk rock clubs in the East Village.
But eventually, the body fails. In 1997, he gets the diagnosis.
Liver cancer. It was terminal. And the doctors believed it was a complication from hepatitis C, which he had likely contracted decades and decades earlier.
From the drug use.
Possibly from a dirty needle during his heroin experimentation phase in the 40s or 50s, or maybe from unsterilized medical equipment somewhere along his travels in the 60s. It's impossible to know for sure. But the result was the same. The doctors gave him a few months to live.
And the way he handled his own death, it feels like his final performance piece, his final poem.
It was. It was a masterclass in his own philosophy. He didn't withdraw. He didn't go to a private hospital room and hide from the world. He went home to his loft in the East Village. And he got on the phone.
The goodbye calls.
He went through his address book, and he called everyone. He called his old lovers, his fellow poets, his students, his friends, his enemies. He called them to say, I'm dying and I love you and goodbye.
Can you imagine picking up the phone and hearing that? Allen Ginsberg on the other end.
The sources say the calls were this incredible mix of sorrow and joy. He was crying, they were crying, but he was also laughing and telling stories. He was wrapping up the show. He was practicing the non-attachment to life that he'd learned from his Buddhist teachers.
And he kept writing.
Until the very end. His last poem, which was titled Things I'll Not Do, Nostalgias, was written just days before he died in April of 1997. It's just a simple list of all the places he won't get to visit now, the books he won't read, the lovers he won't meet. It's this beautiful, sad, accepting farewell to the physical world.
And then he was gone.
But the ripple effect, you could argue, is still moving.
So let's try to synthesize all this. We've covered a lot of ground here. The boy from Paterson, New Jersey, the Mad Mother, the Columbia Rebellion, the vision of William Blake, the obscenity trial, the chanting, the protests, the controversies. When you look at the whole arc, what is the key takeaway? What's the thing that holds it all together?
I think the key to understanding Allen Ginsberg is that he treated his entire life as a laboratory experiment. And the subject of that experiment was radical openness.
What do you mean by that exactly?
I mean, he decided early on, probably because of the secrets and shame surrounding his mother's illness, that secrets are poison, that shame is the enemy of the soul. So he lived his life as a completely open book. He hid nothing. He didn't hide his homosexuality when it was illegal and dangerous to be openly gay. He didn't hide his drug use when it was taboo. He didn't hide his mental health struggles. He didn't hide his most controversial and to many repulsive desires.
It's the complete opposite of how most of us live, especially now. We curate everything. We have our Instagram face, our LinkedIn face. We hide all the messy parts.
Ginsberg put the messy parts on the front page. He made it his life's work. He forced America to look at the things it wanted to ignore. He forced us to look at the madness and ask if maybe, just maybe, the so-called mad ones were the only ones telling the truth.
It brings me right back to that line from his mother Naomi's final letter. The key is in the sunlight at the window. Ginsberg spent 70 years trying to find that key through poetry, through sex, through drugs, through chanting, through political protest.
And maybe he found it. Or maybe he realized that the search itself, the act of looking, the act of living openly and honestly without shame, was the key all along.
So here's a final question for you listening right now. In our age of hidden selves and carefully crafted online personas, could any of us survive the kind of radical openness that Allen Ginsberg practiced? Or was that so-called madness the only thing that actually kept him sane in a crazy world?
It's a question worth meditating on.
That is it for this deep dive on Allen Ginsberg. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.